Hi. I'm John. Thank you for hanging on while we kind of sorted the film stuff out. I set Paddington Printshop up kind of with my partner at the time in '74. That was Pippa Smith. I haven't a clue what I'm going to say. I'm going to try to be as spontaneous as possible. So if you want to join in, that might help me out. I thought there are a few stories. I'd start with my life story, but we might not get beyond 10 minutes. So do help me out and butt in. It's kind of free and spontaneous. The first thing I think I should say is this was not supposed to happen. This was just definitely not the plan. Not an art gallery, not being a proper artist, not sitting back and being nostalgic after 40 odd years. We weren't going to live beyond 21. That was the plan. And at best, if I wanted to be an artist, I kind of wanted to be an artist like the butcher or the baker. Like, none of this kind of, you know, celebrity malarkey. I just kind of thought artists should be people on the street. And, you know, nothing more important than that. But I had this really strange upbringing. So I thought I'd kind of just fill you in 2 minutes where I came from. You wouldn't guess it, but it was a totally working class background. I kind of met the middle class through politics, but kind of when I was about 11, my father became really ill, only child, working class, no books, no education, couldn't even read. And the great thing about your dad getting ill is that he becomes a child and you're free. So 12, 13, I'm hitchhiking down to Aldermaston and kind of, you know, I kind of grow up fast. And my education kind of came through this strange process. The Trots got hold of me, the Trotskyists, by the age of 13. And they taught us how to argue. They taught us how to argue with the communists, who were actually a bit more friendly, and they had a place, and they kind of took us inside and sat us down, and they taught us about philosophy, which of course we did not get at school. And so I kind of joined CND and all that sort of stuff. And then my mate got thrown out for drugs from the Communist Party. So we fled to the Anarchists, who were much more friendly and more accommodating. And in a small town like Sheffield, actually the Trotskyists, the Anarchists and the Communists all go to the same pub. So it's all kind of quite friendly anyway. By the time I was sort of 16, 17, I kind of decided it'd be good to go to art school. This was '68, and a very conservative school. And we'd had career advice. The guy came along, he said, well, there are two choices. There's the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. But there's only two choices because none of you are good enough for the Air Force. And so I went to the headmaster and, well, no, he called me in. He said, Phillips, I've had this application for a reference. And I thought I should share with you what I've put. Really solemn. Phillips has distinct left-wing tendencies, though I believe him to be sincere in these beliefs. I'd never had an interview. You know, they were competing for me. They didn't even look at my drawings and say, oh, we're a left-wing, you know, come to art school. So I did. That was 4 years of kind of just playing. And one of my mates from these days is at the back. We had a small group of kind of me and some guys from the university. It was mainly guys because we hadn't quite managed to get together with girls by that time. But we kind of gave ourselves a therapy in losing Western culture and society and all its restrictions. So it was Coltrane and drugs and hedonism. And also a kind of child genius who was a poet, who'd never been to college or anything, and was 17, but working class again, and putting on plays at the ICA, and was a kind of writer. And he brought kind of lots of influences like Living Theatre and kind of La Mama Workshop from New York, because he was mixing in these kind of circles. We were just kids, but we kind of then formed this theatre group. Well, it was kind of street theatre, but it wasn't kind of agit-pop. We called it trombone noir. It was about provocation. So, you know, one gig, I'll just share one gig. We get all of these cardboard boxes and we stuff them with paper and pour paraffin all over them. We time the police coming in and out and people kind of in the city square. And then we form this big circle, set fire to it, and simultaneously all read the telephone directory. After 5 minutes, we flee. Well, the influence was a kind of small bunch of anarchists kind of in France called the Situationists, who kind of, instead of making art commodities, kind of thought you should make provocations in society and kind of reveal its kind of inner core. One of them dressed up as a priest, went to the kind of pulpit in Notre Dame and said, "God is dead." The audience almost hung him. They were also kind of really influential in the idea of kind of the city and architecture and what the city should be, and how revolution shouldn't just be about, you know, kind of big political things, but it should be about everyday life, and a kind of overwhelming kind of idea that the city should be a place for human emotion, for the complete expression of all human possibilities, for the development of human psychology. So they developed ideas like psychogeography, which have become kind of common. They're even now taught by the Israeli military, because their visions of the city were so radical that actually it's used in military strategy. And there's lots of kind of curators kind of followed their ideas. But they were just a small bunch of kind of anarchists, and we were just kids at the time. This was a kind of early 70s. And that was very different to kind of the world now. Like, lots of people have come in and kind of said, "Oh, you know, it's just like it was then. Nothing's changed." You go, hang on, 1972, we were just going into Europe. There's a poster over there which is kind of solidarity with the Portuguese workers' revolution, kind of 1974. You know, Franco dies 75. It's the end of fascism in Europe. Today, Hungary, it's kind of very, 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 very different. After art school, Pippa and I sort of came to London and this world where there was miners' strikes, builders' strikes, strikes in the docks, more sort of days gained in strike activity than since 1919. There was real sort of social tension. There was war in Ireland. You know, there was kind of really strong conflict, and this kind of culture of people who were squatting, who were kind of political hippies, we were kind of the terrorists of the day. We didn't intend to be, but some people kind of got a little wild, and there were a few bombs that kind of went off by a group that called itself the Angry Brigade. One person got slightly injured in one of those. Maybe it was a bit crazy, but the police swooped almost on anyone who had the kind of credentials that we were sort of operating within. Left-wing, kind of confrontational, go-on demos. They viewed us as the terrorists. This is a kind of Angry Brigade poster of the people. There was a trial by kind of 8 people who sort of got sort of set up, possibly. One person was on trial on his own, and 8 other people sort of were put on trial, and 4 of them got off. But there was a kind of tension between the kind of culture that we were coming from and the squatting movement and what we might see as kind of authorities. And there was sort of huge kind of difference between this sort of slightly anarchic hippie lefty and the real left, the people who really kind of move forward. And we were really liberals. Just a minute, I've got this is how liberal we were, because this is kind of, you know, we encouraged them to come and print with us, you know, and this is, you know, the Trotskyists. Fight for the right to work. That was the absolute opposite of what we wanted. We kind of wanted to fight for the right to play. You know, Maynard Keynes, sort of in the 30s, had written this essay about the future possibilities of our grandchildren, kind of suggesting that actually, if industrialization carries on at the kind of rate that it's going, we'll only ever have to work 10 hours a week. I just wonder what happened. I think everybody became bureaucrats instead. But, you know, Pippa and I end up in kind of London, and I do get, you know, forced off the dole to sort of go and kind of try and find a job. And I had 3 job interviews. Well, the last one wasn't kind of an interview. The first one was a guy called Royds Boyson. I thought I'd go and be an art school teacher. And Boyson turned out to be a really right-wing conservative member of Parliament. But at that time, he was headmaster of the boys' school in Islington, Highbury Grove. And of course, no way was I going to get a job as a teacher. The next one, I kind of found this place that was a photographic processor. I thought I'd learn colour processing. And I went along, and for an hour, they interviewed me on my views on unions. And right at the back, there's a poster called Stand Together, because about 5 or 6 years later, this became the biggest industrial conflict of the late 70s, where a group of Asian women formed a union in this company, which had actually was part of a sort of small group of capitalists that had put together money to sort of support each other if any of them kind of got into a problem, a confrontation with unions forming in their companies. So they were my first 2 job interviews. Absolute failure. And then I was sitting in Camden Law Centre, and I was going to meet a friend, and they were doing this kind of campaign about sort of landlords and things. And they didn't have a proper image of some terrible demon landlord that they wanted to campaign against. They just had a little photo, and I said, oh, well, you know, there you are. Oh, you can draw. And one of the people who'd been one of the defendants in the Angry Brigade trial, who'd been acquitted, Angie, so then working for the law centre gave me the first job, which was, we'll employ you to kind of take photographs for court cases, do kind of graphics for campaigns, yeah. We'll fund you for the next 6 weeks. And for the next 2 years, I kind of carried on doing that sort of work and living here. It's kind of interesting also to think about what was here, because this has always been an area of migration. It's always been an area where kind of new waves of migrants come through, but also kind of where toffs and kind of real folk kind of meet, you know. And exploitation. So the one word we've given to the English language is Rachmanism, slum landlordism. That kind of happened all around here, as did the kind of Profumo, Stephen Ward, Christine Keeler kind of thing. They used to meet in my friend Larry's cafe. So if you kind of look at Carnival 77 back there, Larry had lots of stories about the kind of dudes in the Grove and the Astors and all of that kind of thing. So, you know, we kept ahead of the times. We were kind of there, right in the middle of society, and if it meant that, you know, sex and the drugs and rock and roll brought down the government, so much the better. We kind of locally had a way of doing that kind of thing. One of the sort of people that I was working for, I sort of started making posters at this kind of working from the kitchen, basically, with you know, think posters like this. You know, come to the playground, you know. And I had this 3-tier system, which was bourgeois cultural organisations like theatres. We charged them the most. Kind of grant-aided, kind of community-based organisations like law centres, middle kind of, and then, you know, the assembled rainbow left could come in the kitchen and do their own thing. And one of them, one of the middle tier was a local sort of derelict factory called Maryland's Community Association. And the idea that maybe this could be some kind of community sort of place. And someone called Joel Selburn, who kind of invited me to make some posters and things for that. And it was getting very crowded in the kitchen. And so Pippa and I kind of decided that maybe we could also persuade these people with this empty factory to give us a bit of space, which they did. And we were on the dole, completely poor, and no way, we had no equipment. So we slipped 10 quid, 2 fivers, to these guys who were taking the Ideal Home exhibition apart. And we had this huge factory, it was 17,000 square feet, and they just brought the entire derelict Ideal Home exhibition. And I sat there kind of taking the nails out, kind of bent nails we kind of used for counterbalance, kind of straight nails, we knocked the thing back together, and built a print studio. And then came across this book, you know, Anarchists, 45 years of Arts Council funding. So there's some contradictions here. It's all about the state should be able to distribute wealth, but not power. That's how I get out of that one. But they had this book about community art, and Pippa and I read this and thought, hey, so we were first in the door. And we persuaded them that it was kind of really good to fund this community project, which would work with all sorts of people in a poor and downtrodden area, make posters which they would learn from. They would learn about culture. They would learn about self-expression. And patronizing kind of Arts Council kind of went for that sort of thing. And it kind of went on for the next 10 years. And many of the posters you see here sort of come from that. And also, you know, I kind of described how personally it had been a kind of self-education and kind of education from the CP and things. But also this became my education. On the one hand, making these things with people, but also artists work in their own head and they don't engage with people very much. And so when you kind of come running at kind of other people with their very different kind of thoughts, you don't kind of know quite how to relate to them. The very first poster for kind of Paddington Printshop is sort of like that. Community artists were very much about clowns. So top right over here, kind of, you see there's the May 68 kind of factory poster. We called the derelict factory, the factory kind of a la Warhol and a la kind of May 68. But what you have is a jester, because jesters, they speak truth to power. They criticize kings. If you kind of look at, they always hold a mirror. They have their own image as a doll. Actually, if you look at it, it's a nipping press. He's wearing a paintbrush and a nipping press in there. He has a, you know, emblazoned on his chest, a black rose, a kind of symbol of utopia and the kind of, you know, the kind of anarchist symbol of the 19th century. But it's all about symbolism. You have to kind of be able to reinterpret it like some kind of Renaissance painting. Next to it is what happens within about 2 years, which is a very simple comic that kind of says, hey, the studio is a place where you can come and make your own work. It took quite a shift of working with people to understand what, yeah, that kind of communication is. This poster here, I think it's all kind of rather similar. It says, stop police repression of clowns and street performers. I mean, as you would, you know. What happened was there was a clown in Portobello who was kind of miming and juggling, and kind of all these kids were sort of going, ah! And suddenly the cops come up and beat the shit out of him. And he's kind of dragged away. And so I spontaneously made this for him, and he was absolutely delighted and put it up all over the streets and things. But if you look at the way in which it's done, the lettering is hardly legible. It's sort of almost something for the living room, but not for the streets, whereas we were putting this stuff out on the streets. If you kind of zap forward kind of just maybe a year, you've got posters like this, where, you know, I've learned the lesson that to be politically effective, you use the least resources to the maximum effect. This came about because there was a bunch of kind of National Front people, not local, but they were coming into the area and they were starting to leaflet, and people said, we need something that looks really authoritative, John. So that was my attempt at being authoritative. The factory was a kind of extraordinary place because it sort of attracted these very, very strange and different people. Some of the people that I'd met as a student and kind of begun to work with Pippa were called the People Show. I don't know if you've come across them. They were very, very early kind of experimental theatre. They were active in the arts lab. They were kind of people like Jeff Nuttall, kind of early 60s kind of arts lab stuff. And People's Show were very much about this new fringe theatre, you know, lots of actors unemployed. What do? You form your own theatre group and you kind of develop sort of all sorts of kind of wacky and weird things. So they do street performances. There was one street performance I remember where they had something like 40 suitcases that locked together and just sent everybody off throughout London carrying this suitcase. But when you met another person with the same suitcase, you interlocked and you kind of then, until eventually they had these sort of huge kind of sausages of joined up suitcases kind of going. And of course the police absolutely descended because the Irish bombers, or the IRA bombers, were using suitcases and this was a kind of terrifying thing. But they joined us in this place called the Factory, and they were fantastic at building sets. And the kind of strange, surreal, avant-garde theatre meets community over the jumble sale. I remember we decided to have a jumble sale, and the People's Show built this most extraordinary set. We had this sort of long sort of driveway into the Factory, and it lasted no more than 30 seconds. As people tore it apart and grabbed things, but was the most wonderful, surreal kind of stage set I can imagine. We convinced the people, the Arts Council kind of gave us this grant, so we had kind of a bit more sort of activity and money and things and resources than the rest of the community centre. We convinced them that actually it should be an arts centre, and that if you sold lottery tickets, you could run a bar, because everyone could then win the lottery and go and get the bar. And we kind of had, Aswad was the local sort of reggae band, the 101ers, out of which sort of Joe Strummer sort of moves from being kind of lead singer, joins the sort of Clash, or forms the Clash. So, you know, over there, Maryland's Community Association benefit 25p, you could see Joe kind of performing. What's really weird, we did this and just put the stuff up on the streets. I found a 101ers poster that we did, sold at Sotheby's for $6,250, kind of not too long ago. It's very weird how the world changes. This was not supposed to happen. We were supposed to tear them all up, tear them down. I've still got one or two in the archives. The idea was to kind of work with people from all different kind of perspectives, and that meant that the studio had this extraordinary network of people. You know, literally the Vicar and the Anarchists would kind of help each other print, and it meant that we could begin to sort of not just think about making publicity with people, but actually forming organisations. And the experience in the community centre, the Factory, because we worked to kind of convert it and get funding to sort of make it into a proper community centre, meant that we began to think about organisations and creating organisations. And one of the first that we kind of worked on after the Factory space was Meanwhile Gardens, because Jamie McCulloch, who was the guy who started Meanwhile, and if any of you don't know, if you were to go over the bridge here, there's a kind of 3.5 acre long, sort of really nice public park. And Jamie was the sort of guy who had great ideas, but mumbled. So he could only talk to one person at a time. But he had this idea that you could maybe take derelict land, and there was a lot of derelict land in those days, and convert it to kind of public use. And he persuaded the council to let him have this sort of stretch of land for a while. And he went away and learned how to drive a JCB so that he could shape it. And Pippa and I helped him to raise some funds to get a workforce. And suddenly he had 30-odd people transforming this land, but no way of kind of communicating with them. So we designed a mud kind of thing, exactly the same shape of the garden, and Jamie sat in the hut and sculpted it, and people came in and kind of looked at it and then went and built it. We built the first skateboard park in the country in Meanwhile, and a really interesting thing happened when we were doing that was someone turned up and said to Jamie, if you're building a skateboard park, what kind of spec would you have? And Jamie thought, well, I don't know who this person is. So he gave him some kind of very safe sort of, this slope and that high and that kind of thing. And then after Jamie had finished Meanwhile, these young kids heard about what he was doing, and they'd raised all this money to build their own skateboard park. And so they contacted him and said, can you help us? And so he went along, and they were really good, and they said, we've got these instructions from the Sports Council about what we can do. And of course it was actually what Jamie had written on the back of a fag packet, which had now become kind of law. These things happen. Meanwhile was sort of one kind of way in which, this kind of anarchist notion of people developing programs within their own community, a different kind of politics. There was kind of a public extension of what people had been doing in squats. Because the great thing about squatting was if you wanted to knock all the walls down so that the loo was the most public thing that was there, and anyone who went to it did it in public, well, you could do that. One of the things that's kind of different was, I think about being young today, and one is so constrained by debts, by a lack of opportunities to kind of just get in there. We've robbed you. As a generation, it's really awful. And one of the big differences was the kind of freedom of being able to act, to transform your life, to eat endless kind of terrible lentils, because there was a rota, and everybody kind of cooked the most terrible lentils every day. I mean, that was real freedom for us in those days. But it meant that one could actually begin to start thinking about shaping social institutions like parks. And if you visit Meanwhile, it's very different to the kind of park that would have emerged from an architect and a local authority drawing. These were things that were coming up from within. One of the things that I kind of feel about here was we weren't community artists who descended onto a community. We were just deracinated as everybody else. And so the studio grew out of the community. And we left the factory when it became kind of official and kind of a proper community centre, and had working loos and that kind of thing, and had a proper bar. And we sort of went temporarily and worked in a house quite close by, and managed to get some other premises that we converted. And while we were converting them, sort of worked in this house. And then when we moved, we left behind a women's centre, which then became kind of North Paddington Women's Centre, kind of running for a while. And we simultaneously sort of began to look at forming other organisations. We created a farm called North Paddington Community Farm, which was a real farm with 50 acres, way out in Glastonbury. And it was a bit Maoist. You had to kind of, you go there for the weekend, you had to plant, you had to hoe, you had to, But it was based on the idea that so many people in this area had come from a rural background, and yet had absolutely no way of engaging with England as a verdant land. What other organisations did we found? There was the farm. There were a number. There was North Paddington Darkroom, which was a kind of community-based darkroom that sort of grew out of the factory. There was Paddington Arts, which is a kind of youth programme that grew out of the farm project. So these kind of things began to sort of escalate, and some quite extraordinary sort of projects did happen. A lot of it was based around housing. As you can see, there's lots of kind of housing posters. One was the kind of another empty home. Everyone was getting in on the act of property speculation. So housing associations, social housing groups, were just like anybody else who wanted to speculate on houses. If they were empty, they were valuable, much more valuable. Their price rose more rapidly. So people bought up houses and just left them empty. And so we were approached by someone from one of the housing associations who said, it'd be a really good idea if we could make some posters that identified our housing association's empty properties. We could mark them with kind of big red crosses in a sort of biblical kind of Feast of the Passover way. And then when it comes to committee, I could say, have you noticed that sort of our houses are kind of being targeted in this way? And this then, it grew into a national campaign. And people sort of used this kind of demarking activity to kind of, to actually try to bring these properties into use. There are other sorts of things which were actually more local and spontaneous. I don't know if you can see Freston Road. Freston Road is an area kind of very, very close to Granville Tower, around Ladbroke Grove. And that was a group of squatters that declared UDI. So for about 5 years, they ran their own miniature state with passports, with their own national theatre, with their own stamps, and actually sort of gained some kind of state recognition in small ways from this independent community.
Why is there no passport to Pimlico?
Well, it was passport to Pimlico in irony. The studio, when it sort of moved from the housing, the house in Portnall Road, kind of went to Elgin Avenue, where there was a very, very big squat. And the main squatters' leader was a guy in IMG, International Marxist Group, and very serious. He later became a really well-known meteorologist, and is actually a key climate denier. He was called Piers Corbyn, brother of. Carnival was a very, very kind of important thing. When we were in the factory, we sort of began to work with the first carnivalists. And for me, much of the studio became modelled on, I don't know if you've been to Maz Camps. But Maz Camp is the carnival workshop. Forget the day when everybody gets drunk and kind of, parties. What was extraordinary was this idea where you go to work in the middle of the night because you want to. And you spend the night getting drunk, smoking dope, talking and making things. And that was just the most extraordinary, liberating kind of experience of what a workshop could be. And I kind of worked a lot within Carnival and Carnivalists during those early days. And that really helped in the way in which I kind of thought about how people could work together. It was another part of that sort of education. I think one of the biggest campaigns that we became famous for was the one that we are kind of surrounded by here. And a number of people will kind of know about this because they were there and they were involved. And this was in the very early days of Thatcher. It was kind of early, mid-80s, so into Thatcher's kind of mid-term maybe. And the Tories had decided that it would be a really good idea to sell off housing stock, particularly in Westminster, because they came within 100 votes of losing Westminster. And the head of the council, Shirley Porter, decided that she would sell off housing stock, social housing stock, in order to rig the votes. But she didn't admit that at the time. She just said that she wanted to sell off the housing estate that we happened to be sitting on. So the tenants turned up one day and said, John, could you make a poster saying this is maybe not a very good idea? And so I kind of designed this, we're a little worried about our landlord, initially as a postcard. And it sort of said, you know, the council's trying to sell off all our sort of houses, and if you work in the council, could you screw it up? Just whatever you're asked to do, could you just muck it up in some way? And we printed thousands of these and sent them to named people in the council from named residents on the estate. And this completely blew the council, because we hadn't realized it, but what it revealed was we had access to all of their internal mailing lists, because we were using their computer system, because somebody very, very high in the council was feeding the residents all of this information. And then they brought in the private investigators, and they did all sorts of shenanigans in the press and all of this kind of thing. And it went on for 6 years, during which time the council stopped doing any repairs. And you know, we kind of made all of these sorts of posters. This one was quite funny. At one point, they decided they couldn't sell off the whole estate, so they'd sell bits of it piecemeal. And they found this company of these guys that looked like sort of ex-colonial policemen, and they tried to get them to do the bartering. So the idea was, the council gives you 10 houses, if you're a developer. You do 10 of them up, keep 5 for yourself, that's your profit, and then give 5 back to the council. And these guys were employed to do this barter. And the tenants, which were really good, they would hire these buses, they would all get on board, they'd go along and kind of say, want to talk about this. And of course they did to these guys. They turned up at their office and they looked absolutely miserable. And Phil Walmuth, who was the local photographer, kind of photographed them. And of course, we had all this information about how much they were earning. And so we just made a poster giving their phone numbers, their hourly rates of pay, which was kind of quite high in those days, sort of £45 an hour, £70 an hour, and stuck them up everywhere. And of course, they then put in an enormous bill to the council for the time that they'd spent talking to residents about the selling off of the houses. To cut a long story short, what happened was the government brought in some new legislation that said, well, you know, of course, if you're a bunch of tenants and you want to compete with developers, you have a right. Set up your own development company. So they did. And they put in bid number 1 under this new legislation. And the council did everything in its power to stop it. But they won. They then had to work out how much they were going to have to pay for these 1,000 housing units. And an independent person, you know, knows the value of property, comes in and values it at minus 17 million because of the lack of repairs. So they then...
And the asbestos.
And the asbestos, yes. The council had actually sort of had asbestos in sort of tower blocks there too. So the residents actually were able to form their own social housing group, actually sort of take control and reinvest back. So within a few years they have better living conditions, better health, better job opportunities, a whole range of things, and ultimately become an enormous community asset. We just kind of helped make the posters. But I think it was kind of indicative of the kind of things that had emerged through a whole range, not just us, but the arts becoming active within a community. We also did kind of other sort of strange things. We had for a time a bus stop, the first audio-visual bus stop in the world, where we projected movies, mainly tape slideshows, into the back and played music to people who were waiting for buses. After kind of all this, we began to kind of think, where do you go? And I persuaded the Arts Council that I wanted to rethink my life. The photocopier had come in, people were no longer sort of making or demanding posters like this. So I kind of said, what I'd like to do is to kind of wander around Central America for 6 months and think about the world. And they said, okay, surprisingly. While I was there, I sort of decided to go and spend a week in Cuba, and as you do. And I'd had a friend in London who was a designer, who was Cuban, who said, oh, John, you know, if you go to Havana, here's my designer friend, go and see him. And so I did. So I hopped on a plane, went to Havana, and he said, oh, fantastic. He said, perfect. We're just opening this new screen print workshop. And there are artists from all over Latin America. This is the address. Sort of go and see them. So I kind of toddled off down there. This is, you know, 10 years I'd been making these kind of posters. And all the way down the street was this poster, which was the first poster of the revolution, by a guy called Eladio Rebadura. And so I kind of walk in. I sort of show them my kind of slides and things. And they said, fantastic. You know, welcome, comrade. You are the British delegate. Here's a corner. You know, get on with it. So they're printing these on the presses. You know. So I sit down, and Reagan was doing this deal in El Salvador at the time, where there were money for arms and money for food, kind of all wrapped up together for a kind of right-wing government. And so I sat there and sort of started designing this poster, because the stable crop is maize. And I started designing this poster, which was hand grenades, kind of as a maize field, and a legend that said, you know, America adds iron to the El Salvadorian diet. And this guy, people at the studio, what are you doing? So I think they don't get the joke. So I kind of explained this. No. We understand what you're doing. It's just that we've had 25 years of making propaganda. We want to make art. And we've got this kind of ripping wheeze where we're getting all of these artists like you from all over kind of Latin America and the rest of the world, if we can get them. They come here, they make art, they make all these prints. We sell them internally in Cuba for $50, and then we flog them on the international art sort of scene, and that generates money for Cuba. Oh. This is the road to Damascus nobody told me about, you know, I mean, what do you do? So I sat down and I kind of went back to this guy and, you know, I just met and said, I've got this crisis of conscience, what do you do? Well, you know, you have to start making limited edition prints, you know, that's what we're doing. And we had a chat, and it was the 25th anniversary of the revolution, and, you know, he was kind of saying, well, you know, not everything's perfect, it kind of goes on. So I made my first limited edition print in the workshop in Havana, which I'm now going to show you, which was called Lo que está arriba y lo que está abajo de la mesa, that which is above and that which is below the table. And of course, it is two lovers, and beneath the table there's all kinds of mayhem and kind of chaos, and around them there is the apple and the worm that fall in love, and generally life is consumed and falls apart. And so that's actually how the studio came about, because in that place in Havana, what was set as a seed was the idea that you could have community engaged activities. You could take all of the things that I'd learnt and the others in the team had learnt about developing organizations, and instead of making art that was just about changing the world, we could transfer those resources to working with artists. And so London Print Studio kind of emerged out of that idea that you could end up with a gallery and an evening like this of nostalgia and say, do you have any questions?
Yeah, do you think, in light of what's happened in the last couple of days, that what's wholly lacking in social media, posters are so much stronger because the medium and the message is so much stronger in posters. Do you think there's any way that posters could come back as a tool to spread the word, to Who knows?
I don't know. I mean, I think that one of the problems is the size of the the printer that people have got. And most people have got A4, yeah, which it doesn't have the same kind of thing. Maybe when people have much bigger ones. But I think there's a real problem. In the Situation had this idea that you could derail existing advertising. So they had all these strategies for kind of derailing. Sort of, Jamie Reed, who we kind of worked with really early on, is the guy who did all the Sex Pistols kind of stuff. Jamie kind of derails the Queen by using the safety pin. I kind of use the same thing, sort of Outspan Bitter Fruit kind of does that, because that was kind of Outspan's marketing logo. But I think that kind of idea has now become prevalent. If you look across the internet at protest posters, they, to a very, very large extent, utilize the corporate logos. And the idea may be that you're subverting them. But there is a question of, is any publicity bad publicity? And I think that there is a question about, it's not just the technology you use, but the kinds of ways that you shape and form images that are genuinely oppositional to mammon. And so I think that there is a danger that we've got into in terms of armchair graphic radicalism, which is to simply rely upon the visual imagination of the corporate sector. And so there's something much deeper about how do we make images that are really about expressing what goes on for people, and then how do we use contemporary media to spread them. Another?
I think you should have mentioned the 510 Centre.
I should.
Which was across the road over there, which was an advice centre. So lots of organisations could go there, help set up, and then use the printshop. And in a sense, I think what happened here was very local in that all the struggles and groups and things, what you managed to do was visually amplify it. So stuff was happening, it was visually amplified, and fly posters all over the place. So it was kind of, it was like giving everything a drug, it just boomed. It's very difficult to see how you can do that on the grand scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's needed are...
kind of of the times, really. The technology was of the time. Perfect.
I think people need spaces where they can meet, which is, I think, one of the things that was really positive about a lot of squatting. You could redefine, you could just knock all the gardens together and have a big communal garden. With things like the factory or the 510, there were spaces where different people could meet and things could happen. So it's what's the infrastructure through which kind of engagement can occur, and then I think this sort of stuff kind of comes on top of it. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
You talked about going to Cuba and finding art, as it were, for commerce, and I'm just wondering about whether art is ultimately selfish and that they aren't really community-based. I mean, there's a kind of split or parallel between being community involved and being an artist. Is that tension?
Is there a tension? I don't know. I think there's a false dilemma. I think that if you have visual skills, you can use them for all kinds of things. I mean, I kind of think there's a division between design and art. I think the purpose of design is to make life more comfortable. The purpose of art, the opposite. But you can, I designed the shop kind of back there. I wasn't trying to make life more uncomfortable. I was trying to make it a nice space where you could go. At different times, you can apply the same skills and capacity to different purposes. And I think that we in the West have got some very, very narrow ideas about what it is to be an artist. But if you think of the constructivists, the early Russian avant-garde, they could move between textile design, interior design, kind of radical moves in painting. Hey, it's about horses for courses. Does that answer your question?
Art as a commodity, then.
I think art is actually placing in a space something which is not quite yet been identified, but which people feel that kind of gives shape to something that I haven't quite grasped. Shakespeare sort of says of poetry, it is to give to airy nothing a local habitation and a space. That is, you have something that is in the air, that people kind of recognize, and my job is to kind of give that form, and then those forms become just part of everyday life. Does that make sense? I mean, that's what I think. I think art has a utilitarian purpose to help us to understand the world.
It's interesting because at the recent Basquiat exhibition, they had the graffiti he'd done with his friend when they were both about 16, 17, and then that rolled into their art becoming more widely known in magazines that had a run of about 4, and he ultimately ended up on the cover of Vogue with Warhol. But then he used to drag refrigerators in off the street just so he'd have something to paint, and he didn't have a canvas.
Yeah.
And then paint on the metal and then cut it out, and he covered an enormous range of areas, including music.
Yeah.
So, yes. Interesting.
Well, you mentioned the sort of selling out the youth, inadvertently, that that the young people today have a much more challenging. It's very difficult for them to express themselves in a way that perhaps the generation that these were able to do. And I wondered how we can can bring them in. And I'm sure you run lots of young people's courses and stuff. But, how do we pass it back into them and give them the inspiration to feel like there is possibility of doing things that against.
We create the opportunities in which they can function. We get rid of all student grants, not non-grant, loans. We actually abolish the kind of debts, and we actually provide social housing in which they can kind of get on with things.
Talking locally as people in the community, how do we? I think there's a sort of sense of I'm not going to vote or I'm not going to do this because there's no point, because nothing changes. And I think there's a real danger there. And I wondered how, perhaps if we're talking because this is very local, we're talking locally, how we can inspire young people to believe they can change things, because that's the only way they're ever going to change things.
I think people have to do that themselves. Napoleon was 19 when he took charge of the French army. People have to do that. They have to make demands. I think what the older generation can do is actually, if they're able, create the conditions in which those demands are possible. But I'm not going to tell you what it is. Come and beat me up.
But your experience growing up in Sheffield and being brought in by all these groups of older people, giving you that kind of, hey, here's an open door and here's this and here's this. I worry that there's not enough of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But that's about creating conditions in which people can, demand the right to play.
I mean, do you think because we don't have squats anymore, because the benefits now are so much more rigid, because in a sense all the benefit system allowed huge creativity, waves of creativity everywhere, all the way across England, especially in the north, music as well, because that's all been stripped down. Do you think that has now led to a bit of a cultural desert?
Well,
in the sense of the next generation?
It doesn't provide a lot of opportunities, does it? I mean, it does actually. I mean, I think we've kind of moved from a position where sort of our generation was risky to a point where the current generation is to a large extent in debt slavery. And we have to abolish that debt slavery. And then people can decide what they want to do. But you're right. Opportunities to kind of learn about French Romantic poetry or whatever, really important.
Thank
can I just say one thing that we could do for the kids on that question is that if we kind of got together and took direct action about things, then that's a way forward. I've been involved in Bay 56, which some of you might know is down at Ackland Village, which the community have taken over as a space in kind of direct opposition to the West Way Trust wishes. And now that space is being used for kind of creative pursuit. And there's kids coming in there playing music, there's kids coming in there making art, and you know, that can be expanded on. And now, since then, the community has also taken, basically since Grenfell, you know, because originally that was set up as a Grenfell healing space. And now the community's taken a load of space down at St Mark's Road, and down further down towards Latimer, there's a load of space. So there are a lot of buildings being occupied, and that's more like the kind of 70s style as I remember it, which was people taking direct action instead of waiting for permission and filling out a load of corporate nonsense on forms, and you know, kind of begging for help. Don't ask for permission, just go ahead and do it in the punk way. That's the way you do it. You know, that's what punk rock should have taught us, and that's what we should have learned from the hippie thing that all fell apart. You know, we should learn that from those cultures that we were involved in when we were young. You know? Let's make it go quiet.
No, I agree. I agree. Yeah.
Well, no, I just wanted to make a comment. I wanted to make a comment about young people as well, because this weekend I went to an event called Generation Hope, and it was at the Hammersmith Apollo, and it was all involved, like basically where young people were talking all about how they've transformed crap in their life, whether it's down to do with addictions or to do with pressure, financial creativity, where they feel oppressed, where they feel that they can't express. But there they were on this stage, there were like 20 of them in different guises, talking, sharing about the experiences, how they've transformed their lives. Now, I mean, I think that's really important, because there's 3,500 kids that rocked up to that event. There's more young people talking about how they can change, how they've changed. Now, how did that happen? Sure, it's a Buddhist movement that pulled that together with SGI. Sure, they did that. But take away the ist bit to it for a minute and look at it from a practical point of view. How did that happen? It happened from people like the generations, like most of us are more mature people in this room right now. It's like we give space, our space, to them to talk, to give them the space, to encourage them. You know, that's how it happens as well. The amount of activities that I've ever done in my life, and the 35 years of activism that I've been involved in, the majority of it's gone around the kitchen table. You know, and sometimes we think it's just like, oh, like it's got to be a big place. But actually it can start around somebody's table, and it can start from being the kind of person that listens to young people, and that facilitates something to happen. You know, and I have great, and then that has a knock-on effect that they want to do something bigger, and they express themselves, and we facilitate that. And I think that that's part of it as well, that we can all do something. Like, it's not just thinking, oh, we've got to wait until we get a space. We've got spaces. We've all got rooms in this room, I think, the majority of us. So why don't we share them?
Yeah. On which note, I suggest we share a drink. Enjoy that.